You know, I think I'll play with the Doomscourge now. Hello friendos, this is Chain, welcoming you back to Chain of Commander. It is time for our Patron's Choice Deck Tech of the month, and for this month, I gave my patrons the choice amongst the uncommon legends to come out of Kaldheim, and in their infinite wisdom, they have decided that they wanted to challenge me with a Kardur Doomscourge deck. Kardur Doomscourge is 2 black-red for a 4/3 legendary creature Demon Berserker. When it enters the battlefield, until your next turn, creatures your opponents control attack each combat if able, and attack a player other than you if able. And then also, whenever an attacking creature dies, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. So, clearly this guy's all about attacking. He wants to see everybody attacking everybody, and he wants to see a lot of creatures die in the process. So, how do we take advantage of this ability? Well, I have developed the unpatented, not even close to pending, steal and sack technique. Now, if you don't know what that is, if you can't figure it out, don't worry, it'll become pretty apparent soon enough in this deck tech. But let's start with pretty much the veggies of the deck, all the stuff that doesn't really fit in to the have fun portion. So we're going to start where I start all my decks, with the ramp. Now the ramp in this deck, for this section, you might think is a little bit light, but that's because there's going to be more of it later. I'm just going to be focusing on the non-synergistic ramp first. It'll be the same thing for the removal and for the card draw, so you might think it's a little bit light now, but really it's just the stuff that doesn't fit into more impressive categories. So as far as our ramp is concerned, we have things like Solemn Simulacrum, Sad Robot. He gets us a basic land when he enters the battlefield, and when he dies, he can even draw us a card. We have Arcane Signet and Talisman of Indulgence, things that can produce our colors right out of the box. And we also have Rakdos Signet as a way to produce our colors as long as we have a mana to filter into it. And lastly, we have Soul Ring, pretty ubiquitous in the format at this point, but definitely easy slot into this deck. So like I said, very light in terms of the non-synergistic ramp, and now we get to move on to the even lighter non-synergistic card advantage. As far as our non-synergistic card advantage is concerned, we really only have 2 cards that fit in this category. We have Andy's Ravager, which when it attacks, when it needs to attack each turn, each combat of Fable, when it attacks, you discard your hand and draw 3 cards. So good way to kind of keep us going through our deck, making sure that we always have something in hand. And then we have Sign in Blood, which is an easy way to pay 2 life and draw 2 cards. You can also target our opponent. If we have an opponent at 2 life or left, we can target them with this to kill them. So, like I said, very light there, but then we're going to go on to the removal here, which is a little bit more impactful. Now, as far as our removal is concerned, we have pretty targeted things. We have Cast Down to destroy target non-legendary creature, Dreadbore to destroy a target creature or planeswalker, and Hero's Downfall, which does the same thing, destroys target creature or planeswalker, but it does it at instant speed. We have Court of Ire, which can do 2 damage to any target at your upkeep, unless you're the Monarch, in which case it does 7 damage instead, and that's no light amount of damage. Then we have Rakdos Charm. This is a kind of a modular piece of interaction here where we can either nuke a graveyard, we can destroy an artifact, or if a player has developed too large of a board state, we can deal damage to them equal to the amount of creatures they control. And then lastly, we have actually a lot of board wipes, but these are not board wipes you're going to see all too often. We have things like Cinderclasm, which does 1 damage to each creature, unless you kick it, then it does 2 damage. We have Inflame, which does 2 damage to each creature that dealt damage this turn. Lava Storm, which does 2 to each attacking or 2 to each blocking creature. And then Volcanic Fallout, which does 2 damage to each creature and player. And as far as actual full-blown more regular board clears are concerned, we have things like Blasphemous Act, just to do 13 damage to each creature to handle the much more bigger and complicated stuff that might come along. So, we've got through the chunk of stuff that I declared non-synergistic. They didn't really fit into the other categories for this deck. But now we can start dipping our toes into this deck strategy with tokens for everyone. Now, when I say tokens for everyone, I do mean for everyone. For us, for our opponents, everyone in the pod is going to be getting tokens from us. For ourselves, we have things like Annex Hardened in the Forge, which just makes us Satyr tokens whenever a non-token creature of ours dies. We have Carry Zev, Skyship Raider, which just makes a monkey token whenever it attacks. Tilonali Summoner. We can dump red mana into this one here to produce a bunch of elementals when it attacks, and if we have City's Blessing, those elementals get to stick around. And then we have Zurzoth Chaos Rider. Whenever opponents are drawing excess cards, we get little devil tokens that we can use to ping people. They do 1 damage when they die, and it also provides some amount of card filtering for us. And then as far as sharing the token love, we have things like Acroian Horse, which we can give to a player so that all the other players get little soldier tokens at that player's upkeep. And Varchild, Betrayer of Kaldor. This is the one that makes the coward tokens. Cowards can't block and cowards can't attack you. So, if they can't attack you and they can't block, they might as well just be attacking all of your opponents then. Alright, so why do we want to give our opponents tokens? Well, let's keep moving. Now remember how I said earlier, Kardur is all about attacking. So we need to make sure our opponents have creatures to attack with, which is why we have the tokens. But we also need to make sure that they actually do attack with them. So we have a bunch of things in here that really instigate the table, and we really take advantage of the goad mechanic. Goading means that a creature that is goaded has to attack its next combat, and it has to attack a player other than you if able. So a lot of these cards, well, let's just get into it. You'll see what I mean. First, we have Agitator Ant. This lets your opponent's creatures get bigger, but if they choose to make their creatures bigger, then that creature is goaded, so you're protected from that creature for the turn. Geode Ranger. This goads a creature whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Goblin Racketeer. Whenever it attacks, it goads a creature. Grenzo Havoc Razor. Whenever a creature of yours does combat damage to a player, this either you have a choice of letting it goad a creature your opponents control, or you can choose to look at the top card of a player's deck and choose to cast that card if you want to. So that's pretty neat too. Then we have a couple of auras, the Impetuses. We got Parasitic Impetus and Shiny Impetus. These are both enchantment auras that can be put on an opponent's creature. It gives it +2/+2, and it goads them, so they can't attack you when it's attacking. And they have cool abilities for Parasitic Impetus. It drains the creature's controller 2, so they lose 2 life, you gain 2 life whenever it attacks. And then for Shiny Impetus, you make a treasure token. So that's a little bit of more synergistic ramp in this deck, like I mentioned earlier. Better categories for it. And then we have Bloodthirsty Blade. This is one of the few artifact equipments you can actually equip to an opponent's creature. It has an activated ability at sorcery speed to allow you to attack it to an opponent's creature, goading that creature. Then we have Disrupt Decorum. This card is pretty bonkers. Until your next turn, all the other creatures are goaded. It is essentially kind of a one-sided, not necessarily board clear, but a great way to make sure your opponents are defensed down or forced to attack into unoptimal attacks to really kind of handle their boards and leave them open more or less for your next turn's attack. Then we have a couple other things that they encourage the attacking here. We have Frenzied Saddle Brute. This gives your opponent's creatures haste only if they attack somebody other than you. Then we have Goblin Spy Master, which gives your opponents little creatures that say that they must attack each turn if able, forcing them to attack, even into unoptimal attacks. And then we have Angel's Trumpet. This is an older card, but this is pretty neat. It gives everything essentially vigilance, but if they don't attack with a creature, that creature gets tapped at the end of turn, and then for each creature tapped this way, it deals damage to that creature's controller. So a great way to kind of encourage people to attack, and then even if they don't, take a little bit of damage out of it anyways. So we're finally getting people in there and attacking. How do we make sure they don't attack us? Well, we got some plans for that as well. So like I said, we're trying to get people to attack as much as they can to take advantage of Kardur's ability. But there's a decent chance they'll want to come in at us because we're the one causing all the trouble. And now the goad mechanic is a great way to start. But we have some other things in play that allow us to kind of protect ourselves a little bit here. We have Blood Reckoning. If a creature attacks us or a planeswalker we control, its controller loses 1 life. Hissing Miasma, same thing, but only if they attack us. They can still get away with attacking the planeswalker. Marchese's Decree. This is another one that when the creature attacks us or a planeswalker control, its controller loses 1 life. But we also get the Monarch out of it, which plays nicely with the aforementioned Court of Ire. And then lastly, we have the Revenge of Ravens. Whenever a creature attacks us or a planeswalker we control, not only does its controller lose a life, but we also gain a life as well. A little bit of incidental life gain kind of helps out with this deck a little bit. So, at this point, I want to know if you folks are kind of liking where this is going. I think you're starting to pick up on how this deck is supposed to function, and we're not even into the meat and potatoes of the fun stuff yet. So, hit that like button to show it, and let's now move on to the steal of the Steel and Sack. Now, when I say steal, I mean exactly that. We are going to be, maybe not stealing, we'll be borrowing our opponent's creatures for a combat here or there to really swing in with it. So we have things like Jeering Instigator, which is a morph creature that when you morph it, allows us to take control of an opponent's creature until end of turn. Besmirch does a very similar thing. It lets us take control of a creature until end of turn, and also goads it for that turn cycle as well. And then we have Carry Zev's Expertise. This allows us to take a creature until end of turn, as well as get a free spell off of it. Then we have ones that kind of do the same thing, but they can start hitting more than just one creature. So we have Harness by Force, which we can strive, so pay a little bit extra for each additional target we have. And Mass Mutiny allows us to take 1 from each opponent and attack with it. Then we have so much more encompassing options. We have Mob Rule, which allows us to take control of all the tiny creatures CMC 3 or less, or mana value now, mana value 3 or less, or mana value 4 or more, so we can make our decision there. And then we have Insurrection, which allows us to take everything for a turn and turn it sideways at our opponents. Then we have Twist Allegiance. This isn't really taking or borrowing a creature because we have to give something in return. Essentially, we trade creatures with an opponent for the turn, so we can use it to use their war state to attack a third opponent in ways that might not be optimal for those creatures. And then lastly, we have, he's a bit of a meme, I'll admit, but we have Tybalt, the Fiend-Blooded. Even though he's a bit of a meme, he is a low cost. His discard ability doesn't really mean too much for us. And his ultimate is a second instance of Insurrection, which might be the most powerful card in our deck. So having it there and ready for us is a neat little thing. So we've gone over the steal. Now let's go over the sack. Not only are we stealing our opponent's creatures to attack with them, we're also going to sack them to be a very efficient way of removal. And to that end, we have a variety of sack outlets in this deck that also give us extra little bonuses. So we have Yahini, Undying Partisan. This is just a free sack outlet that allows us to give it indestructible. We have Silumgar's Butcher, which we can then sack a creature when it enters the battlefield to give something -3/-3. We have Eradicator Valkyrie. This is one of the new boast cards. When it boasts, we can sack another creature to force all of our opponents to sack a creature or a planeswalker. We got Rakshasa Gravecaller. This one, when it enters the battlefield, we can choose to sack a creature to get a couple zombie tokens. Bantu the Glorified and Viscera Seeker. These are both ones we can sack creatures to scry to help set up our draws and make sure that we're not getting stuck mana flooded or whatever. Erebos Bleakhearted and Vulturous Aven. These are both ones that allow us to sack creatures to draw cards. So even better than scry, just keep drawing. And then even better than drawing is straight up tutoring. So we got Sidisi Undead Vizier, which allows us to sack a creature to go through our deck and find whatever card we might need. And then lastly, as far as our sack outlets are concerned, we have probably the two best ones in the deck. We have Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. Both of these allow us to sack creatures for mana, which means we can ramp with them, we can just easily get rid of them, and because they are technically mana abilities, they cannot be responded to. So I think you're starting to pick up where this goes here. We do have a couple more things I want to get to. We're going to call them the Finish and Flare, because these are things that didn't really fit into any other category. So let's get to those right now. Alright, for our Finish and Flare, let's focus on the Finish first. We just have two all-time classic Aristocat cards in Blood Artist and Zulaport Cutthroat. Both of these can take advantage that we are sacking our own creatures, or well, our opponent's creatures under our control, to start doing damage to each opponent, as well as Blood Artist will just do damage regardless of who controls which creature, which way, and anyhow. We have Tuk Tuk Rebel Fort, which is one that I really didn't know what category to put this one in. Essentially, he gives all of our creatures haste. I know we had a card that gives your opponent's creatures haste. I guess we could pair it with that, whatever. And then lastly here, we have Chandra Torch of Defiance. This is just an all-around great utility planeswalker. It's ramp when you need it, it's card advantage when you need it, it's removal when you need it, and his ultimate is very game finishing in a lot of situations. So that is our flair, that is our finish. And before we finish, we got just a mana base and a couple more intricacies of the deck to go over. I hope that you folks have been enjoying it so far. If so, definitely consider hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to have you folks join us going forward for deck techs like these and just general other chit chat on the Commander format. That said, let's get to this mana base here and then wrap up with a couple tips and tricks of how to play. Alright, as far as our mana base is concerned, it's nothing really crazy at all. We have a bunch of lands that can represent two colors in Blight Step Pathway, which on the other side is Seer Step Pathway, Canyon Slough, Dragon Skull Summit, Foreboding Ruins, Smoldering Marsh. We have the Temple of Malice, which also allows us to scry when it enters the battlefield. We have Command Tower as just kind of a dual land, I guess, in this deck. And then we have Castle of Embrith. This one allows us to pump our team. We're often going to be swinging with potentially a lot of creatures at once. So being able to give them all +1/+0 is no laughing matter. It can represent quite a lot of damage. Then we have a bit of a desert package. You know me, I like my deserts. We have Desert of Fervent and Desert of the Glorified. These are the two that cycle. Then we have Ramunap Ruins, which we can sack deserts to do 2 damage to each opponent. So we can get a little bit of extra reach out of that. We have Scavenger Grounds, a desert that we can use to hate on some graveyards. Similarly, we have Bajuka Ball, which is a one-time graveyard exiling effect. Then we have Phyrexian Tower. This is a little sack outlet built right into one of our lands, which we can then use to sack our opponent's creatures for mana. Then, as far as our bases are concerned, we have 9 swamps and 14 mountains. So, that is the deck. But now I want to take a step back and I want to go over some of the tips and tricks as far as playing the deck, because there's some cool rules we could take advantage of here. Alright, for all these tips and tricks we have, you might have noticed that a good chunk of those board clears I had only did 2 damage to the creatures, and that's because we're not using them as outright board clears. You would notice that those were all instant speed, which means we can cast them during combat. So after creatures take their combat damage and they have damage marked on them, quite often they might need not more than 1 or 2 to be taken out. And that's why we have these very low costed but low damage doing instant speed board clears so that we can wrap up a bunch of surviving creatures in combat and get those Kardur triggers. They also kill off all of the tokens that were given out. So a great way to make sure that even if our opponents do have a bunch of tokens from us, they can't use them, they're dead. And the reason why we want all that at instant speed is because there is a cool little period in the combat phase after you do damage, but before you leave combat, where we have the ability to kill or sack or whatever to get our Kardur triggers. We do not need to sack creatures or kill creatures before they do combat damage to have them be considered attacking creatures. We can wait till after combat damage, and after combat damage is done, but before we leave the combat step, we can then sack all of our creatures to a sack outlet. We can cast one of our board clears to clear a bunch, so we get the best of both worlds. We get that combat damage in, and we get all those Kardur triggers. That is a huge bonus to this deck that this deck can really take advantage of. And that's also why the Steel Sack combo is a great piece of removal, because when you steal everything, if you have a sack outlet, not only are you stealing and attacking with it, but then you're also getting rid of that creature before your opponents can get it back. There's going to be plenty of times where you can cast an Insurrection and you have, like, say, a Phyrexian Altar out, swing in with everything, and if for some reason people aren't dead, you're going to sack them all, and just they don't get them back, and you are just going to be in excellent shape. This whole little game plan here also works really well with Karizev's little monkey there, or Tillinali Summoner Elementals if you don't have City's Blessing, because they're going to exile themselves anyways. Just sack them. Sack them, get any of your sack value out of them. Sell them a simulacrum and get your card draw. Woo, go you. So that's essentially the deck here. It's pretty fun. Comes in at under $300, and it's definitely one of the cool. I think Kardur, he also has probably one of the coolest showcase frames from this set. That thing's super badass. But I thank you very much all for joining me today. It's a pleasure having you, and I hope to see you guys again in the future.